It's the week ending Saturday the 17th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a 3-tier COVID-19 plan rolling out across England, opinion polls showing Donald Trump losing senior voters in Florida, and Apple unveiling the new iPhone 12. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Ollie Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from The Week Junior is editor Felicity Capon, from Money Week, Mr. John Stepek, and our debutante at the ball this week, freelance journalist Kieran Yates. Hi, Kieran.
Hi.
Here is the obligatory embarrassing moment. Please tell us a fun fact about yourself that Google could not supply.
I am unofficially training for a strong woman competition at the moment.
Wow, an exclusive. Felicity, you're starting the show this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Die or das, and why that could no longer matter.
Hallo Leute, heute geht es die Geschlechter im Deutschen. Wie ihr wisst, gibt es 3 Artikel. Die ist der weibliche Artikel, der ist der männliche Artikel und das ist das Neutrum. Und viele Leute, die Deutsch lernen, haben eine sehr lange Zeit Probleme damit, die Nomen mit den Artikeln zu lernen. Also man muss immer wissen, welches Nomen welchen Artikel hat, damit man sie auch richtig im Satz deklinieren kann.
Yeah, from the Easy German YouTube channel, that is How to Know a Word's Gender. Wunderbar, Felicity. Was ist das?
The story this week is that an argument has erupted after Germany's Justice Ministry drafted a bill that uses only feminine endings. So legal texts in Germany usually use the masculine version of words, such as employee or landlord, which would cover both men and women. But not this bill, which will only have female endings. And this has caused a bit of a fuss.
Because men, basically, are somewhat affronted by this and saying, this law doesn't cover me, exactly how women have felt for centuries when we talk about the male endings to represent everybody.
I think so. So the Interior Ministry has got involved, and they've made the point that actually it's incredibly confusing because some people might only think that this bill relates to women. So it might actually bring about confusion. But the draft law is actually on insolvency and restructuring, and it exclusively talks about female employees. So you could see that is possibly a legitimate ground for confusion, but obviously this is a bigger campaign. It was the first time I'd heard about this story actually, but when I looked into it, it's been going on for years across Germany. There's been debates about this, and it's a lot of feminists saying it's completely unfair that plural nouns in Germany for people typically take the masculine form, professions are usually gendered, and that's unfair. An example of that would be mixed groups of pupils would be masculine. And Angela Merkel is the Bundeskanzlerin, which is the feminine, whereas a male leader would be the Bundeskanzler. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. I did not do German at school.
Okay, so some new German laws on insolvency, typical light reading for you, John. Do you think that it is actually a bit confusing for business? And this is the point that Wolfgang Steiger, the secretary of the CDU party's Economic Council, said. He said the business world had no time for gimmicks. It's a bit condescending, but it's true, isn't it? Whatever you think of the gender politics, the generic masculine version has been the grammatically correct version for decades.
I get where he's coming from, and it's the kind of typical thing that you expect to hear from someone in his position. We've already mentioned that, if it's the first time that they're doing this, or one of the first times, and you've got used to it being men is just the generic form, and suddenly you're using the female form, then I get that you could turn around and say, oh right, is this only applying to female bankrupts? At the same time, it's not really that complicated, to adjust. As soon as someone said, oh no, when we're using female in this piece of legislation, we're referring to everyone. And unfortunately, I don't know enough about the German legal system or the German language because I didn't study it at school either. But I'm assuming that they don't have a lot of laws that are explicitly only applied to women of this nature. So really, I think it's just your standard, this is political correctness go mad kind of objection. And while I often have sympathy with those things, I just struggle to get worked up about this one.
I suppose the argument, Kieran, is that it's actually just not important at the moment. We've got so much going on in the world that, yes, this feels unjust to women, but it's unjust because of historic sexism. That doesn't mean that it's embedded now, and changing it now is going to confuse people at a time when we've got other things going on.
It has very effectively derailed the conversation away from the details of the bill and turned it into something much bigger, which is often what happens with these kind of cultural conversations, isn't it? And I guess I have two initial thoughts. One is that whenever you have these kind of conversations, you need bodies like the German Language Association behind you. And my sense from reading around this story is that they're not necessarily. And so sometimes these conversations have to live in different places, and sometimes they need to be springboarded by a piece of legislation that starts a conversation. And I guess my second thought is that, I was reading this, I just thought, by now, aren't we just so used to this cycle of something which is seemingly inflammatory? For a lot of us, it's not really that big a deal. But it becomes so quickly co-opted by an old guard who are immediately in fear of a new Germany or wanting to go back to how things were and dig their heels in. And if language reflects the cultural moment that we're in, this seems depressing.
So is that why it's important, Felicity, for you? Is that why it's your story of the week? Because language does reflect the cultural moment we're in. And, that's why it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obviously not just a story that focuses on Germany. You have other gender-inflected languages, as they're known, such as Spanish and French and some of the Scandinavian languages. And it does matter because the generic masculine is not read generically, it's read as male. And I would recommend Caroline Criado Perez, her book Invisible Women, where she talks about language, and in her introduction, where she says that a lot of job vacancies in gender-inflected languages are still announced using the masculine form, which can be incredibly off-putting for women, particularly in leadership roles. And just to back that up, a recent Austrian study of their language used in leadership job ads found a 27-to-1 ratio of masculine to gender-fair forms. The World Economic Forum carried out some research that found that countries with gender-inflected languages are the most unequal in terms of gender. So I think it does matter, and you only have to look at the pushback when this story comes to the fore to see how incredibly unhappy it makes people, to show that it's a really big deal. And even in this country, where English is not gender inflected, in 2017 you had the first female head of London's fire brigade, Danny Cotton I think her name is, who wanted to replace fireman with firefighter, which is now standard. And she faced an absolute barrage of hate mail.
Yeah, I think stories like this can often serve as kindling for the old guard to dig their heels in and resist change. I think that's certainly something that we've seen politically in this country. I think you're seeing it with the rise of the conversation surrounding the AfD in Germany. You're certainly seeing it coming from Trump and his guard. I think that this is the thing. It's like, it's true, this is what happens. In the UK over here, as soon as you start advocating for more female-friendly policy, it naturally moves into policy that talks about trans rights and the Gender Recognition Act, and then it looks at BAME disparity, and it starts to work on other things. And I suppose, for better or for worse, we're in a moment in culture where some people see that as deeply terrifying, and some people see that as deeply liberating.
I think that's a really good point. The increasing conversations we're having about how non-binary people want to be addressed to and addressed as, and you're having that in this country as well, with people wanting to self-identify as they, them, rather than he, she. And actually, it's really fascinating when you look into it, because there are countries with languages that they are finding ways to eliminate the binary and express verbs or nouns in gender neutral ways. So Hebrew speakers in Israel and other Jewish communities are doing that. And in 2015, so actually quite a long time ago, Sweden added to the country's official dictionary the word hen, which is a gender neutral pronoun that linguists had pushed as an alternative to the male pronoun han and the female hon. So it is happening.
It makes more sense, though, doesn't it? I don't know anything about Swedish, but it makes more sense, John, in other languages where they doesn't also mean plural. That is confusing in this country. We've run into that on this podcast before. We're trying to do the right thing. I remember us talking about someone who identified as they, them, who had unfortunately been a rape victim, but they were part of a group of women. And so when we were talking about it, it was just very difficult because we kept saying they. And then, of course, it sounded a bit like we were making an allegation that a group of people had been attacked when it was actually an individual. I'm not saying this is a reason not to do that stuff, but I'm saying it is complicated.
The problem is that you start to go into it, right, oh, well, okay, we're going to have to use this new set of pronouns, but it's very hard to mandate a change to language. Language evolves.
But when John says, Kieran, that language evolves, that is true, isn't it? It does evolve. Only evolves by people changing their use of it.
I think that language just evolves. We learn. We're in an age of self-learning, of peer learning. We're in a moment where a lot of this education is actually not coming top down as it has historically. A lot of this is coming from the ground up. So people who have first-hand experiences are able to articulate the ways in which we can use language. And through use, we learn, and then it just sort of becomes part of our day-to-day. So I don't know how much I buy into this idea of it being tricky to organise, because all language is tricky to organise. We all have to learn different language when we're moving in different spaces. We've all been in workplaces where we've had to adopt language that doesn't necessarily make logical sense in terms of the use of how we've applied it previously. And we do that. I think we move, we evolve. I don't think this is too difficult for us to take on board.
Okay, John, you're up next after this. Okay, John, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
One small step for man, one giant leap for stellar bureaucracy.
Hi, I'm Todd Harrison, Director of the Aerospace Security Project at CSIS. On Friday, May 15th, NASA announced a new initiative known as the Artemis Accords for establishing partnerships with other nations to go back to the moon. The Artemis Accords are a set of bilateral agreements between the United States and partner nations for how they will work together safely and cooperatively on and around the moon.
The Centre for Strategic and International Studies Aerospace Security Project Director, Todd Harrison there. That's a hell of a business card, isn't it, John? What's he talking about?
Basically, this week, Britain, the US, Japan, Australia, Canada, Italy and the United Arab Emirates all signed up to this set of rules called the Artemis Accords. And what this boils down to is that America's got a plan to land the first woman and the next man on the moon by about 2024. And this is like, the mission's called Artemis. And these are rules that sort of advance on a 1967 treaty that basically govern how we approach space exploration and how different countries around the world can cooperate on it, and how we can also make sure that no one's basically trying to make a massive land grab for bits of the moon or other planets.
So hold on, it's an international treaty, but it's named after the American mission. Does that not seem like a paradox?
Yes. And also, you'll have noticed that there were two fairly significant space powers that weren't in that list of names that I just reeled off.
Yeah, and that would be Russia and China. Quite likely to be up on the moon soon as well. So if they aren't signing up to the treaty, what's the point?
Well, I mean, I suppose the point is that you need to start somewhere. The Russians basically didn't sign up because and although they have partnered with NASA on the International Space Station, they do see this as being too US-centric. So they've said, right, we're not going to sign up to it. As far as China goes, at the moment, NASA's actually not allowed to work with China. So even if China did want to sign up to it, they couldn't, because obviously they're not allowed to work with them anymore because relationships have deteriorated to that point. To be fair, and note that was since 2011. That's not actually something that's happened in the last few years.
Okay, and I'm very pleased, and I speak for everybody, I'm sure, that you've brought us a story which appears on the surface to be entirely unconnected to the banking crisis of 2008. But why, John, is this your story of the week?
I mean, I tried to drag 2008 into it, but even I couldn't find some sort of link to it. I think this is extremely, the way I think it's important, partly because I find space exploration quite exciting, but I also think that it's interesting for a number of reasons. We haven't actually been to the moon since 1972, and so there is the question of, like, well, why now? Why are we doing this just now? And I think that there are many factors behind that. So the last time that we had this kind of space race, obviously we were engaged in a Cold War. And ultimately, the reason that the kind of space race then led to us having lots more rockets and bases on the moon is because the Americans beat the Russians to the moon. And then everyone got bored, basically.
Well, and also everyone ran out of money. That's the other thing, Felicity, isn't it? We've actually discussed on this podcast a couple of years ago when NASA announced that they wanted to go back to the moon and that they were going to send a first woman there. Why now? Why go to the moon now? But the question's worth asking again in 2020, isn't it, when you consider the sums involved and the global recession we're in?
Yeah, and I think that's key to this because I think they do need the support of Congress for these trips off into space and to make sure that the money's there. And I think In the past, Trump has been quite hesitant about it. I think he tweeted that it's got to be less about the moon and more about Mars, because the public attention is more wrapped by the idea of getting us to Mars.
Although that does involve the moon, doesn't it? Because you sort of pit stop on the moon on the way to Mars.
Part of the point of the Artemis Accords is that the moon would be seen as a fueling station, as a way to get further out into space. So it is all connected, certainly. But I do think that there is that kind of very fragile interplay between politics and the space people here, for want of a better word. With the ISS, you have Russia cooperating, you have these international astronauts out there working together, which is really great. And I think a lot of what's in the Artemis Accords, coming to astronauts who are in distress, sharing the results of experiments and tests, I feel like the space community are like, sure, we would do this anyway. It's when you start adding in governments and politics where the whole thing gets incredibly murky, I would say. But aside from that, it seems 2020 is definitely the year that the space race is hotting up, because you just have so many countries who are now trying or have got up there, including China, India, Israel, so many others. And not even that, you also have the commercial private companies. So it certainly seems like a huge year when this has come hurtling back into our lives.
That's the big change, isn't it, Kieran, to space travel as we've known it before? It is all these commercial companies that are on the brink of sending up corporate clients, wealthy individuals on holiday. Maybe you lose some of that bonhomie between astronauts that you get.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? I wonder how much of the motivations of this kind of space travel coming from astrophysicists and how much of it is coming from corporate interest billionaires. I've been thinking a lot about space travel in the last couple of weeks because the New Yorker published a beautiful long read a couple of weeks ago by Rafi Kachdorian, and he used a lovely phrase in it that we were being circled by a corona of trash. And he was basically talking about how each trip to the moon leaves behind it lots of space debris or space junk, which is very dangerous and can cause lots of high-speed collisions and have torn material in the International Space Station and all this kind of thing. And really, the point that the piece was making is that we really need to slow down even these conversations about moving into space, going to the moon, because the expert advice coming from scientists, researchers, people who are in the know, have been studying this for years and years, are telling us that it's really dangerous.
And arguably some of that space debris, John, might be those American flags that got planted up there. Are the Americans having it both ways here? They're saying internationally we'll all cooperate not to lay claim to any part of the moon. But by the way, part of our strategy is still to bolster President Trump because of, say thank you for the money for the space program.
This is one of those things where you've just got to expect countries to act in certain ways. I don't think anyone's going to go up to the moon. If Britain landed on the moon, then I reckon we'd probably poke a flag in there, and believe me, the Chinese and the Russians would too.
Bet we wouldn't. I bet we'd put like a giant bag of PG tips or something.
You're probably right. It'd be some grim bleeding time capsule like that. Imagine if it was Voyager.
It would be a blue PG tortoise.
I know. You get surprised when he wakes up from hibernation. One of the things with this is there's a couple of things. So they're trying to agree on essentially the technology so that it's all compatible, which does make a lot of sense. It's almost like the space program running on HTML. And there are elements of, I think people recognise that space debris is definitely a big issue. And that's partly because the more satellites that we're like slinging up there, the more chance there is of a collision. And nobody really wants that, because obviously the satellites are the things that run our GPS and all that sort of thing. It really is interesting because it's this area where you have different national interests competing, but you do also have it's really vital that when we are actually up there, we're trying to cooperate. And there is a kind of weapons race element to it as well. We're trying to avoid militarising space, because if you can create a satellite that can shoot down nuclear weapons, then suddenly the nuclear arms race hots up as well. And with the Americans doing this mission, if they're going to get there first, then it does make sense that they've taken the lead on, look, let's try and clarify what the ground rules are, because we're about to land up there. We know that China's wanting to put somebody on the moon. We do all want to get to space. There's commercial potential out there for mining. In fact, and one of the things they've added into this treaty that is slightly concerning some people is that there's areas you would describe as a safety zone. So it's if American astronauts land somewhere and they say, right, we're going to mine this bit, we're going to have to...
Mine for what?
minerals, space minerals, moon rock, stuff like that. No, you can get lots of metals from...
That's different to the certificate I got from W.H. Smith for a tenner that says I own a portion
Well,
of
see,
it,
this
right?
is another thing. You know, what's going to happen to all those people that say they laid claim? You know? It's like, if America lands in your patch...
I look forward to that trial.
Can I just say as well on that point, I love that the space race or this element of competition takes every form. So there's even a space race when it comes to the debris cleanup, and different countries are putting kind of money into the development of different tools on how to do this. So I think France are working on like nets. The US are looking at lasers, and people are looking at things to send out. There's always this kind of show of American might.
Some of the business opportunities being proposed that would make use of them are utterly mad. I was reading in an article that there could be an opening for companies that would ship the ashes of loved ones to the moon as a memorial. And you suddenly think of rockets.
Why are you saying that with scepticism? I see that.
Is that what you want? Is that the plan?
For the man who has everything, why not?
They already do it in Japan. It's quite cheap as well. They send up a balloon with the cremains that can go out to, you know, the very edge of space. And then your loved one drifts off peacefully into outer space.
Felicity, is this depressing, though, that despite most people saying that most of what's in this accord is fairly inoffensive, it's still apparently impossible for the world to ever find a set of policies on which all the world's nations can agree?
I think it depends whether you're a glass half full or glass half empty, and I think there's enough in this story for both the cynics and the optimists. The stuff about the interoperability, the idea of making spacecraft where other nations' spacecraft that all matches up and can all work together is quite nice. The countries that have signed up to it, and I think that more countries eventually will sign up to it. That's all something. But on the other hand, there clearly are commercial interests here. Is the US being slightly disingenuous that it is hoping to nick a load of lunar materials and claim them for its own? You can see it both ways, I would say.
Glass half full, glass half empty, whatever, it doesn't belong to Russia or China. Kieran's up next after this. Okay, Kieran, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this the week unions gained online influence?
Guys, we're in a really uncertain time when it comes to work and your rights and legislation. So I would say, if I can give you one piece of advice, join a union. They were my absolute saving grace and safety net when I was employed by a big company, and they know so much.
Love Island star Amy Hart on Twitter back in May. What's the story this week, Kieran?
So this week, The Guardian published a long read which shed a light on the Creators Union, which is the UK's first union for digital content creators, of which Amy Hart would probably describe herself. And it's kind of part of a bit of a nexus of this kind of thinking, obviously amplified by these COVID times that we're living in. And it also mentions the American Influencer Council and various other sort of places across Europe that are starting to join into this conversation.
Okay, so this is a union in the style of a trade union, but for influencers, as in people who post photos of themselves on Instagram and are basically self-employed, right?
Yes, they're basically self-employed. It's interesting because they're sort of asking for a new digital media type union framework and also an artists union framework. So they're mixing kind of two of these ideas and trying to work out how they can best protect themselves. And there is reason to protect themselves. Over the last couple of years, as the industry has got huge, I think it's a £4.3 billion industry in the UK. And I think it's projected to be like, in the next 5 years, up to £17 billion worth of revenue. So this is definitely a time that influencers are kind of coming together and talking about their rights. And there is a bit of an argument to say, yes, perhaps they are getting ripped off in the same ways that self-employed people get ripped off, not getting paid on time, chasing invoices, having image and exclusivity rights written into their contracts, not being officially recognised as union members.
I was listening to a podcast episode where Matt Lucas interviews influencers on his show Bitch, Bitch, Bitch. And they were talking about this disturbing trend where real life experiences are now becoming bankable and what companies want to monetize and feast off. So you get these huge followers and they want to know about the ins and outs of your life. And one influencer was talking about how she lost her baby, she had a miscarriage. And eventually this was something that she was bringing into her her livelihood and her work as an influencer. And I think that's becoming more and more the case with social media, that you're seeing this weird blurring of lines and sort of companies. She was saying that companies were putting pressure on her to post about this dreadful thing that happened to her and saying, we can send you cream for stretch marks and for hair loss, and you can promote these. And it was just, it was just sounded really quite disturbing and quite a horrendous way to have to make a living. There's so much of it going on right now. There was Chrissy Teigen, who she live tweeted about her losing her baby, didn't she? Which that provoked a huge fuss.
But isn't that just the distinction that we've always had in celebrity culture, tabloid celebrity culture, between people that are famous for doing a thing? They used to be a singer, but now they are out at nightclubs and having their picture taken, but still ostensibly had a career background. And people who are just famous for being famous, who actually, that is the job they chose to do. They chose to do a job where they're going to sell every element of their life, including their weddings and their divorces and their miscarriages. And it does make people feel icky, but actually social media has just brought that to more people. It's democratized it. You don't need an agent behind you anymore, but it always has been a job.
I guess the question is about how we work now and whether we want to take those worst practices of the workplace forward in the way that people are working in the future. It's certainly true that this is a community of sort of artists, creators, celebrities to a certain extent who do get a bad rap and are often lumped as the same thing. And they're seen as highly individualistic, as sort of bastion of like neoliberal dread because they represent everything bad with late stage capitalism. But actually, I think that there is a lot to be said for the way in which they're mobilizing communities and saying, okay, this is work that we do. What are some of the rights that other people have enjoyed? What can we learn from those? And how do we try and take some best practice moving forward? How do we learn from labour unions and what trade unions have done badly? And how can we try and fix them as we move into new media world?
But John, there's no point being unionised if the companies that you're negotiating with don't take the union seriously. And I wonder why a large company, say a corporate advertiser, would negotiate with a union of influencers when they are not, when all's said and done, directly employing the people being represented.
Where I would say this still makes sense is that really what you've got, let's park the debate about what they do, because ultimately all they are is freelance creatives. So they're, freelance marketers, freelance journalists. This isn't a particularly new business model. It's just there's been a lot of disruption and a lot of the middle people have been kicked out. Agents, etc. are no longer part of this. PR people are less of a part of it. So really what you're doing is basically a union for creatives, and what they probably need more than anything else is a source where they can get legal advice. Because the stuff that they're working with is difficult. Things like image rights are complicated, copyright's complicated. So from that point of view, it's useful. And also, I think a lot of the time, it's not necessarily... We kind of get into the bad habit of talking about big corporations kind of like ripping people off. I'd imagine the best ones in terms of actually fulfilling people's contracts, etc., are probably the bigger corporations, and the ones that are going to rip you off are the smaller end, and the ones that are predating on the people who are desperate to get into this industry. I was reading about one influencer, one of the big Italian Instagram influencers, and she's about to go public. She's about to list herself effectively on the Milan Stock Exchange. A lot of these influencers themselves have a great deal of power now, and that is the other reason why I guess companies will be listening to them.
Does that kind of story, Kieran, actually, and this one, show that there's just a kind of sophistication that's happening with an approach to influencers? They've become integrated into the business world, particularly in promotions. People understand that they're an important part of the ecosystem now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we can learn a lot from how the working world is responding to them. So I thought in 2008, when the Advertising Standards Agency basically said that they had to be transparent about products that they were sponsoring, which is mad to think about it now, before then that they weren't. But now they have to have a clearly defined hashtag to say that this is a sponsored piece of content. I thought that was really interesting because it really showed that they were almost being legitimized by the ASA. This is how the world is working now. This is the way that influencers are working in the world. This is how you can be monetized. And we need to recognize that. And this has massive implications for the way that we're going to work over the next few years. In the same Guardian article, they said that only 4.4% of union members in the UK are 16 to 24. If at least this kind of opens a conversation about why labour unions might be important or why they might give us something that we can learn from, that surely has to be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, that, I wonder, Felicity, do you ever touch on this subject in the Week Junior? Is that something you can explain to a young audience, why you should join a trade union? I think for the longest time, it's felt, I don't know, a bit 70s, hasn't it? It doesn't feel like something that kids either come out of school wanting to do or actually think is economically justifiable. It's a lot of money to join a union.
It's a lot of money. I also just don't think they're thinking about it at all. I think it does seem like something of a bygone age and something that young people aren't even aware of as a possibility. No, I don't think we have covered it in the magazine, but I don't see why we shouldn't. I think it would be good to know about. That's the thing, is that young people today, with everything being so shaken up by the pandemic and by world historical economic inequality, you're seeing more young people seeing the world of work as a sort of individual thing. You can go off and become an influencer on your own. It's to do with yourself and your personality that you can make money out of it. And the whole point of a union is it's about the collective. And so I think there's that shift where you are seeing work now as all sorts of almost like scams, like different ways that you as an individual can sell off your personality or sell off your lifestyle and make money. And the whole point of unions is collective action. So I think there's a friction and a tension there, and I'm not quite sure how that will play out in the next few years.
And one final thought on this, John, the converse opinion, I saw this articulated by Dylan Jones in his editor's letter in GQ this month, is that because of the pandemic, people will feel that the influencer era is over, that actually the idea of people whose lives is just being paid to promote products and go and stay in hotels and they're not actually being authentic about why they love it, they're only doing it because they're being paid money, was tapping into what felt like authenticity but isn't. People now realise that they're looking for real, honest, heartwarming voices. They don't want influencers anymore.
What's that magic line from one of the advertising gurus? If you can fake authenticity, you've got it made. It's all about this. It's been about this since when advertising was invented. It's like it's that fundamental conflict between I'm trying to sell something, but I'm trying to sell it in an honest manner, because that's more effective. I mean, that's it. I don't think that there's anything new about this. Dylan might be right to say that, it's the end of the influencer in terms of the person who is clearly sitting on a bed that's been shipped in, painting their nails with something else that they've got from someone else, etc. But there'll still be plenty of room for the people that can. Again, the authenticity thing is why there are a lot of people who are willing to do this kind of confessional sort of stuff. And to be fair, that's something that you see in journalism as well. There's plenty of opinion columnists who have made their fortunes over the years by saying things about themselves that would make the rest of us just, shrivel with embarrassment. That fundamental conflict is never going to go away.
Okay. Up the workers. Fun story. Thank you, Kieran. Appreciate it. And that is it for this edition of The Week Unwrapped. A big thank you to Kieran and John and Felicity. And I can honestly tell you, using all my powers of influence, that our entire back catalogue is a strong united front and well worth a listen. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Ollie Mann, unrepresented unfortunately. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week. Bye-bye.